She stood close to the desk, one hand resting on her unfinished notebook, the other gripping the lapel of his shirt. A white dress shirt, wrinkled from the rain, infused with the scent of old paper, cigarettes, and something unmistakably masculine that she couldn't tear her senses away from. Outside the glass window, the rain drummed on the tin roof, each beat echoing the frantic, erratic pounding of her heart. Daniel's face was so near she could see every bristly stubble on his jaw, even the small scar beneath his left eyebrow, a detail she had never dared look at directly in the past 4 weeks. "Claire, stop," he said, but his voice had lost all certainty. She lifted her face, lips pressed tightly, her amber-brown eyes holding something that terrified him more than the day he'd been expelled from the university lecture hall a year ago. That look, not innocent, not calculating, was simply, achingly real. "Have you ever kissed your student before?" she whispered. Daniel clenched his fists, stepping half a pace back. It wasn't enough. Her scent lingered in the space between them, warm, damp, and so youthfully fresh that with just one more breath, he felt he might lose all sense of reason and conscience. "You're my student," he managed to say, "but I'm old enough now. And I've never kissed anyone before." The silence that fell after her words was heavier than the thunder outside. He looked at her, a 19-year-old girl with eyes caught somewhere between dream and longing, standing there in the darkness, the soft gold from the lamp filtering through the curtains making her bare shoulders shiver. Whether from cold or desire, even he couldn't be sure. Claire leaned in. Daniel did not back away. And their first kiss, unlike anything he had ever known, happened right then. Fast, so fast, like a secret touch between two worlds that should never have collided. When their lips parted, the world was still silent. But inside him, every principle had shattered. That was their 13th night studying together, and the very first night neither of them could remember that there had ever been a boundary between them. Daniel Holt arrived 15 minutes late for the appointment. He stepped through the wrought iron gate of the Duvall mansion on a May afternoon when the city was quietly shifting into the rainy season, the last rays of sunlight falling onto the tiled courtyard like a velvet gray carpet. Each of his footsteps echoed sharply on the stone walkway, damp and dark from the rain, blending with the scent of ylang-ylang trees and the humid breeze drifting up from the garden. Inside him, there was nothing but a sense of unfamiliarity, not with the tutoring work he had done for years, but with this very place. A suburban mansion, tall white walls, frosted windows, an iron gate always locked as if afraid the outside world might intrude. Daniel once stood confidently before hundreds of students, used to walking into seminar rooms, crossing his legs and reading Baudelaire poetry to a silent, enraptured lecture hall. But today, as he stood before the door of number 17 Duvall Lane, he felt more like a wanderer knocking on a stranger's door, with an old leather satchel and a shirt faded from too many hand washes. The new chapter of his life was beginning here, not on the podium, but in a small classroom on the mansion's 3rd floor, surrounded by cold walls and with a student he had never met before. He pressed the doorbell. A silver-haired housekeeper opened the door, her eyes scanning him from head to toe, pausing briefly at his dark shoes still stained with mud. Daniel offered a polite smile. "I'm Daniel Holt, Miss Claire's new tutor." She nodded, her voice soft but cautious. "Please go up to the classroom on the 3rd floor. The young lady is waiting." Inside, the hallway stretched out, deep red carpet beneath his feet, wallpaper patterned with old-fashioned florals. The stillness was so complete that Daniel could hear the grandfather clock on the upper floor ticking away each minute. A crystal chandelier cast fractured shadows on the floor, making everything feel even colder. He followed the housekeeper, every step on the staircase creaking so softly it seemed the house itself was whispering secrets long asleep. On the third floor, she stopped before a heavy oak door. "Please go in. If you need anything, call me from the kitchen." Daniel nodded, left alone in front of the door. He took a deep breath, mustering the composure of a man who'd faced his share of awkward situations, though something about this moment slipped beneath his guard, a nervousness, an awkwardness he couldn't remember feeling in years. He knocked twice, and the door swung open from inside. No sound, just the scent of old wood, a faint note of jasmine, and piano music suspended in midair. Claire sat at the desk beside the large window, her back to him. Her black hair fell straight down her back, her petite shoulders wrapped in a cream-colored sweater. The twilight painted her face in patches of shifting light and shadow. Without looking up, she spoke, her voice as cold as an autumn wind. "You're late." Daniel was a little surprised, but quickly regained his calm. "There was traffic. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting." Claire still didn't turn, her gaze fixed on a blank notebook, her slender fingers spinning a pen as if playing with the very silence between them. "I don't like waiting," she said, her tone even. "But my parents have paid you. I suppose you won't ignore the paycheck." Daniel smiled, this time unable to hide a hint of irony. He was used to stubborn students, but rarely one so aloof on a first meeting. He set his bag down, pulled out a chair opposite her. "No one likes waiting, not even me. But sometimes, the most valuable things only come after a long wait." Claire looked up for the first time. Her amber-brown eyes, wide and bright, met his without a trace of fear, defiance, or even regard for the rules of teacher and student or any social limits at all. He saw something raw loneliness, a hint of resentment, a spark of curiosity, and deeper still, a hunger that felt almost instinctive. "So, are you here to teach me or to philosophize about life?" she asked, lips curling in a faint smirk, her gaze brushing past him as if looking right through him out into the gathering dusk. Daniel opened the textbook, slipping into a professional tone. "Let's start with modern English literature. Did you read the poem I sent you last week?" Claire shook her head. "I don't like poetry, it's boring." "What do you like then?" Silence. Outside the window, twilight thickened, and rain began to fall in earnest. The only sounds in the classroom were the pen scratching across paper and the faint beat of Daniel's heart. He wondered if Claire could hear it. Suddenly Claire spoke, her voice slowing. "I like silence. I like late nights. I like the feeling of being alone in a room, no one bothering me." Daniel nodded, gently closed the textbook. "So do I." They fell silent together this time, an unspoken understanding settling between them. Daniel knew this first lesson would be unlike any other. Not just because of his unusual student, but because of the strange feeling growing quietly from that very silence. The lesson passed in that atmosphere. Claire didn't ask, Daniel didn't press. He lectured on modern poetry in an even tone, analyzing every image, every metaphor in Auden's Funeral Blues, but it felt like he was speaking more to himself than to her. Every now and then, Claire would gaze out the window, following raindrops sliding down the glass, scribbling a few notes only to erase them immediately. Sometimes Daniel caught her watching him, not as a student looks at a teacher, but as someone wanting to explore, to test both their limits. That look reminded him of his first time before a packed lecture hall. The the sensation of being scrutinized, measured, and yet weirdly exhilarated. When night finally fell, the warm yellow lamp bathed everything in a soft glow. The housekeeper brought in a tray of hot tea, placed it silently on the table, then slipped away. Daniel smiled his thanks, but Claire remained silent, eyes on her notebook, her slender fingers playing with the edge of a page as if waiting for something far beyond knowledge. Daniel asked quietly, "Which university do you want to try for?" Claire didn't answer right away. After a pause, she said, "I don't care. My parents pick a school and I'll go wherever they want." "And what about you? What do you actually want?" She looked up, her eyes suddenly darker. "Do you know what it feels like to not want anything? To just want everything to end or disappear?" He looked at her for a long time, not replying. In that moment, Daniel realized Claire was unlike any student he'd ever met. She was at once childish, melancholic, and desperate for someone to pull her out of the muddy rut of a life already mapped out for her. The lesson ended when the rain had stopped, and the sounds of insects began to stir outside in the garden. Daniel packed his books, about to leave, when Claire suddenly asked, "Do you think poetry can change someone's life?" He stopped, looking at her in the lamp's glow reflected on her hair. "I think, if someone is willing to truly read it, then maybe. I don't believe that. I think poetry is just a pastime for lonely people, or for those pretending to be special." Daniel let out a soft laugh. "Maybe you're right, but sometimes loneliness is exactly what lets us touch the most beautiful things." Claire said nothing more, but as he reached the door, she suddenly asked, "Will you come back?" He turned to her, and this time her eyes held not indifference, but a subtle longing, as if he said no, she would never ask again. "I'll come back. Every evening if you need me." Claire nodded, lowering her gaze to the page. Daniel closed the door behind him, making his way down the stairs with the scent of jasmine, old paper, and those eyes, tough yet fragile, still lingering in his mind. That night, in his tiny old rented room, Daniel lay still on the bed, eyes fixed on the peeling ceiling. Outside, far off, the rain began again in soft waves. He remembered Claire's eyes, her question about poetry and loneliness, and wondered. In the end, who needed saving more, the 19-year-old girl in her wealthy house, or himself, the man who had lost all faith and was just scraping by each day? Daniel had no answer. He only knew that after that first lesson, he was already looking forward to the next, more than he cared to admit. And somewhere in that silent third-floor room, Claire sat motionless by the window, tracing shapes on the foggy glass, silently asking herself, had her real life just begun, or had she merely turned the page to a darker, more uncertain chapter? 3 days after the first lesson, a heavy rain fell, the road leading to the Duvall mansion all but vanishing beneath a sheet of white water. Daniel parked his bicycle under the eaves, his shirt soaked through, hands trembling from the cold, yet inside he felt none of the irritation that usually came with such weather. He realized, no matter how much he tried to hide it, he had been waiting for this moment. Waiting to walk up to the third floor, to see Claire again, to search her eyes for any lingering spark from their previous encounter. Today, the classroom door was left ajar. The faint sound of piano mingled with the falling rain and the delicate scent of jasmine in the air. Daniel knocked softly, then pushed the door open himself when he got no response. Claire sat at the desk, hair loosely tied, wearing a wide white shirt. The room suddenly felt smaller, warmer, and so quiet that Daniel had the sense he'd stepped into a private space the world had forgotten. "You're late again," Claire said, not turning around, her hand tracing meaningless circles on the desk with her pen. "This time it was the rain. I couldn't help it," Daniel replied gently, smiling as he set his bag on the opposite chair. He glanced around and noticed a thick, red-covered poetry book on the shelf that hadn't been there last time, a few pages marked with pale yellow sticky notes. On the desk, Claire had placed a small porcelain dish with several pieces of dark chocolate, a rare gesture of unspoken sharing. "Did you read the poetry collection I gave you?" Daniel asked, taking out the textbook and wiping a raindrop from its spine. Claire shrugged. "I did, but I didn't like those poems. I found another one that's more interesting." She slid him a printed page, clear type at the top. "Lust" by Lord Byron. Daniel glanced at it, a bit surprised but hiding his reaction. "You like poetry about desire." Claire turned to look at him, her brown eyes deep and cloudy, yet glinting with something both provocative and innocent. "I want to know why people write about things they're not supposed to say. Why do you think that is?" Daniel fell silent for a moment, then smiled. "Because forbidden things are often the most alluring. Literature dares to give voice to what we can't admit to ourselves." He looked at Claire, sensing she wasn't just curious about poetry, but was also testing his own boundaries. A quiet pause passed, the rain outside seeming to hush, leaving only the two of them, two souls more exposed than in any previous meeting. "I have a lot of questions," Claire said softly, "but I'm not sure who to ask." Daniel sat down across from her, telling himself he'd keep everything within the bounds of a lesson, but even he wasn't sure how far those boundaries still stretched. "About what?" he asked, doing his best to keep his voice steady. Claire rested her chin on her hand, staring straight into his eyes. "Have you ever been in love?" Daniel hesitated, unprepared for such a direct question. Before he could answer, Claire continued, her voice almost too soft to hear, as if afraid to wake something sleeping. "Not the love in books or poetry, but the kind that makes you lose your mind, that keeps you from sleeping, from studying, from thinking about anything but that one person. Have you ever felt that?" Daniel was silent longer than necessary, then answered quietly, "Yes, but love doesn't always bring happiness." Claire let out a cynical little laugh, her gaze turning cold. "Then, why do people keep writing about it endlessly?" He looked at her for a long moment, seeing in Claire a longing to touch what was forbidden, just as he had once lived for a love that was never accepted. "Because people don't know any other way to free themselves from it," Daniel said. "They can only write, or love, or hurt themselves." Claire watched him closely, as if committing every line of his face to memory. "If I asked you about things not in the syllabus, would you answer?" Daniel nodded slowly. "If you truly want to know, I'll answer, within my limits." She tilted her head, her eyes sparkling with calculation. "So, what do you think matters most when a girl kisses someone for the first time?" Daniel faltered, caught off guard by the question from a student just old enough to be an adult, in this silent, pressurized room. But he didn't want to appear uneasy. "Maybe it's genuine feeling. Not technique, not experience, but a real spark, even if it's just for a moment." Claire said nothing, then suddenly lowered her face, her cheeks coloring with an unfamiliar blush. Daniel realized that beneath her seemingly provocative questions, she was still a naive girl, inching along the border between curiosity and the hunger for experience. He gently asked, "What are you thinking, Claire?" She replied, so softly he had to lean in to hear, "I think, if I ask any more, there may come a point where there's no way back." Daniel smiled, but inside a vague anxiety stirred. He didn't know when it had happened, but every lesson, syllabus, and principle he once held had begun to thin before this young woman's offhanded questions. Time seemed to slow in that third-floor room. The lesson drifted by, filled with questions about poetry, about short stories, about loneliness and instinct, interspersed with silences longer than necessary. Daniel realized Claire often intentionally got a simple question wrong just to have him stand close, to correct her by hand, or sometimes to let their hands brush, accidentally, yet with intent. Once, while Daniel was explaining to his coy mistress a poem about desire suppressed by time and convention, Claire suddenly asked, "If it were you, would you choose love or do what's right?" Daniel was taken aback. He looked deep into her eyes, catching both challenge and hope. "Sometimes those two things can't go together, but I suppose I'd still choose love. Only the price for it is usually high." Claire said nothing more, but he could feel the temperature in the room rising, not from the weather, but from the unspoken tension growing between them. Once, Claire accidentally spilled her water on her notebook, the liquid creeping to Daniel's shirt as he bent to help her wipe it up. They were close enough to feel each other's breath. Daniel catching the faint scent of Claire's damp hair, her fresh, innocent skin, making him hastily stand and avoid the gaze of the girl biting her lip to suppress some very real emotion. At the end of the lesson, as Daniel was packing up his notes, Claire suddenly asked, "If I ask for advice that has nothing to do with studying, would you give it?" He nodded, a little hesitant. "How do you know if you truly want something, or if it's just curiosity?" Daniel considered. Wanting is a feeling that lasts, curiosity is a brief spark. If a thought keeps repeating itself in you, no matter how you try to push it away, then it's real. And if it scares you, but you still can't let go, maybe you should try it, just once. Claire smiled, a smile mixed with triumph and the confusion of a child doing something forbidden for the first time. "Thank you, teacher. I think I'll try it tomorrow night." Daniel didn't ask what she meant and didn't dare. But that night, as he left the third-floor room, he realized he, too, had been swept up in Claire's questions beyond the syllabus. There are things that, once asked, are enough to upend the world of a grown man, and sometimes just one lingering gaze is enough to steal an entire night's sleep. Beyond the window, the rain continued. Claire rested her chin on the desk, watching the glow of streetlights flicker against the wall, her eyes shimmering with unspoken thoughts. Outside, Daniel walked through the rain, his heart flooded with a certainty that things were slowly slipping beyond his control. But at the same time, he had never felt so alive. The oppressive summer air coated the city in a thin layer of humidity, the heat clinging even after night had fallen. Daniel rode his bicycle to the Duvall mansion as the clock crept past 8:30 p.m., feeling a strange unease inside. He had lost count of how many times he'd told himself to keep his distance from Claire, to act only as her tutor, but with each passing evening, that line blurred, as fragile and easy to shatter as the dusty glass in the third-floor study. Tonight, the mansion was completely silent. The housekeeper had taken leave to care for a sick relative. Claire's parents were away on business, leaving only the warm yellow light spilling from the upstairs window, a quiet signal of anticipation. Daniel slipped through the door, climbed the familiar stairs, his heart caught between anticipation and apprehension. Claire was alone in the study, bathed in soft lamplight that seemed to separate her from the rest of the world. On the desk, her literature exam lay face down, notes scattered, a cup of tea gone cold, and an empty porcelain dish beside it. Daniel knocked and stepped in, noticing Claire in a thin white dress tonight, her hair let down, covering half her face, her eyes fixed on the page before her. "You didn't do the test?" Daniel asked, trying to sound stern. Claire didn't reply right away, only spun her pen between her fingers. After a moment, she looked up, her eyes sly yet tinged with bitterness. "I don't like doing tests when it's hot. Besides, there's no one else at home." Daniel sighed, sitting across from her, making an effort to keep everything professional. "Studying is your responsibility, not anyone else's. You need to take care of yourself, Claire." Claire let out a faint laugh, leaning toward Daniel, her voice softer. "You're always so serious, teacher. Even tonight." Daniel sensed a shift in the air, as if everything in the room was aware something unusual was about to happen. He reached for his book, about to start the lesson from scratch, when Claire suddenly asked, "If I do poorly, will you punish me?" Daniel froze for a second, unsure how to respond, but Claire leaned in and whispered, her voice a blend of teasing and innocence. "Or will you stay and teach me again, just the two of us, even if it's late?" A question that sounded so light, yet instantly thickened the atmosphere in the third-floor study. Daniel looked at Claire and caught her gaze, defiant, inviting, almost pleading for rescue. He wanted to look away but couldn't. "Do you think you can avoid everything by being stubborn?" Daniel asked, his voice dropping lower. Claire rested her chin on her hand, smiling slightly. "No, I just want to know, if I don't do things right, what would you do?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He pulled her test from the stack, glancing at the hurried, messy handwriting. Most answers were cursory, with many blanks left unfinished. Claire remained silent, eyes never leaving his hands, as if waiting for a verdict. "Do you want me to grade it, or would you rather have another chance?" Daniel asked, but he already knew tonight would not end like any other night. Claire stood, walking behind his chair. Daniel could feel his heartbeat stutter, her footsteps barely a whisper on the carpet. He kept his eyes on the paper, but the words were just a blur. When Claire stopped directly behind him, he felt her breath on the back of his neck, jasmine and a faint trace of tea. "Have you ever read love poems to anyone?" Claire asked, her voice a whisper against his ear. Daniel was motionless, his hand gripping the paper so tightly his nails left dents. "Yes," he answered hoarsely, his voice roughened by the tension between them, "but not for a long time." "Then read one for me, right now." Daniel thought to refuse, but when he turned his chair, Claire's gaze had already locked onto him, giving him no escape. He picked up the poetry book on the desk, flipping randomly to a poem by E. Cummings, lines about longing, love, and desire. His voice was deep, steady, filling the little room with only the two of them present, each word grazing their skin like a caress, haunting and intimate. Claire closed her eyes, listening in silence, her hand gripping the edge of the table, bare feet trembling slightly beneath the golden light. When Daniel finished reading, silence fell over them. Claire opened her eyes, looked at him for a long moment, then suddenly leaned forward, her lips brushing his cheek. So brief Daniel barely felt it, yet enough for a flush of heat to ripple through his body. He started to rise, to put distance between them, but Claire slipped her arms around him from behind, hugging him. Not tightly, but genuinely needing to be held. Daniel turned, their eyes meeting. No longer teacher and student, no more barriers, just two people lost together in a summer night. Claire whispered, as if afraid even she would hear it, "I'm afraid. If you leave tonight, there won't be anyone left with the patience to sit with me." Daniel trembled. He knew the line he was about to cross, but also understood he couldn't turn back. Claire lowered her head and pressed her lips to his. Their first kiss, light, trembling, but burning with intensity. Daniel tasted the faint sweetness of chocolate on her lips, tea, and a loneliness so deep it felt endless. He cupped Claire's face, returning the kiss, lingering and hesitant, like someone touching the forbidden for the very first time after years of only dreaming about it in the dark. They quietly gave each other everything words had never managed to say: desire, pain, fear, hope, and release. The kiss lingered, slow and gentle, a mix of yearning and fear of discovery. Outside, the rain grew heavier, masking every sound in the room. The lamp's light painted gold on Claire's skin, Daniel's hair, and their fingers tangled atop the old wooden desk. They only parted when both were breathless, Claire's eyes shining with both fear and boldness, Daniel dazed as though he were a young student again. In that moment, there was nothing but raw vulnerability, two lonely souls finding each other in the suffocating, silent heat of summer. Claire leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder, tears falling onto his collar, while his hand gently stroked down her back, wanting to protect something fragile, dangerous, right and wrong all at once. Suddenly, a noise sounded in the hallway. A door slammed, hurried footsteps across the wooden floor. Daniel and Claire sprang apart, hearts pounding. He quickly straightened his shirt. Claire wiped her tears, sitting back at the desk as if nothing had happened. But that kiss, that trembling, would never fade. That night, as Daniel left the mansion, his mind spun with a storm of feelings: regret, fear, and the strange sense of youth returning after years of loneliness. Claire stood silently on the third-floor balcony, watching him leave in the rain, her eyes flickering with uncertainty and hope. They both knew something had changed. No more exams, no more roles. They had opened the door to a new world, a world with questions no syllabus could answer, and forbidden desire only waiting for its chance to explode. After that night's kiss, the whole world seemed to slow down for Daniel. In the days that followed, he received no messages from Claire. His phone was eerily quiet, no questions about homework, no reminders for their lessons as usual. Daniel lived in a state of uncertainty, half waiting, half dreading, his mind haunted by Claire's eyes in the rain, the sensation of her lips pressed to his still as vivid as if they had never been apart. In the evenings, he would sit by the window of his rented room, listening to the distant hum of traffic, his heart filled with confusion. He tried to rationalize everything as an accident, a moment of weakness, a mishap that never should have occurred between two people who were never meant to belong to each other. Yet the more he thought, the more his longing and desire grew, weighing on his every breath. Daniel was tormented by his own questions. Had he gone too far, broken some unbreakable rule of life? And more than anything, was he secretly hoping Claire would be the one to break this silence first? For 3 days straight, Daniel did not return to the Duvall mansion. He feigned illness, sending the housekeeper a polite message, maintaining the proper tone of teacher and student, avoiding anything that might touch on the memory of that night. But deep down, he knew. He was running from Claire, running from himself, lacking the courage to face things directly, and yet unable to turn away completely as his reason demanded. It wasn't until late afternoon on the 4th day, as Daniel sat gloomily at his desk piled high with old books, that the door to his room suddenly swung open. Claire appeared without warning, bringing with her the scent of an early summer rain, her hair damp and clinging to her cheeks, her eyes red from crying. She wore a pale gray dress, slippers on her feet, one hand clutching a small notebook. the only thing she brought besides the cold wind following her into the room. Daniel froze. He wasn't sure if he should be relieved or alarmed. But when he saw the tears trembling in Claire's eyes, every wall he had built instantly collapsed. "I'm sorry," Claire said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do. After that night, I was scared. I was afraid you'd hate me, despise me, or you'd just leave like every other adult." Before Daniel could speak, Claire dropped onto his bed, hugging her knees, trying to stifle her sobs. In the cramped, musty room, the smell of damp mingled with her rain-wet hair, making the air thick. Daniel felt both pity and a deep, sharp pain in his heart. He sat down beside her, his hand hesitantly resting on her shoulder, not daring to embrace her, only touching lightly as if afraid any more contact would shatter everything once again. "You didn't do anything wrong," Daniel said softly. "You don't have to apologize. I'm the one at fault. I should have stopped things. I shouldn't have let it go so far." Claire shook her head, tears dripping onto her dress, her voice breaking. "I knew you'd say that, but I don't want apologies. I just want you to tell me the truth just this once. Do you feel the same way I do? Do you want me the way I want you?" The air grew thick. Daniel looked at Claire, for the first time fully facing what had happened. No more hiding, no more running. "Yes," he breathed, soft but certain. "I can't stop thinking about you. I'm scared. I'm ashamed, but I can't deny it." Claire looked up, her eyes glimmering, half broken, half blazing. She didn't say anything more, just quietly slid closer, burying her face in his chest. Daniel held her tightly, for the first time without fear or guilt. In that moment, both knew. They had crossed the line, willingly trading every ounce of peace for a moment together without the need for excuses. The rain outside never stopped, the wind slipping through the cracks in the door, bringing a chill that also made the space feel strangely private. Daniel pulled the old blanket over Claire's shoulders, his hand gently smoothing her tangled hair. She looked up at him, her lips dry and trembling with emotion. "I don't know if I have any right to ask you this," Claire whispered, "but I don't want to leave. Not tonight. I don't want to go back to that mansion, don't want to be the obedient student anymore, don't want to wait anymore." Daniel stayed silent. Inside, a fierce battle between reason and smoldering desire, years in the making, finally found its answer, not in any lesson or book, but in this very moment when he realized he was no longer strong enough to refuse what he wanted most. He pulled Claire closer, kissing her forehead softly, then her cheek, the bridge of her nose, and finally her lips. This kiss was no longer awkward, no longer furtive or hesitant. It was a confirmation, a confession that needed no words, a final blow to every rule they had clung to. Claire responded, her arms around his neck, breathing quick and shaky, tears mixing with laughter. In that cramped room, their bodies found each other like two lost souls in a midnight forest, knowing only together could they feel safe. They wrapped around each other in the dim yellow light, surrounded by rain and rapid breaths, exploring each other for the first time with trust as well as touch. Daniel guided her gently, without haste, every caress, every kiss, every embrace imbued with a newfound reverence. Claire trembled, fearful, eager, openly embracing emotions she'd never known before. That night, they spoke little. Everything was feeling, breath, racing hearts, the fear of loss and the joy of being found. When it was over, Claire lay against Daniel's chest, breathless, tears and sweat mingling, peace settling for a brief moment after the storm of emotion. At dawn, as the first light crept through the window, Daniel woke to find Claire still asleep beside him, her black hair draped over his shoulder like a silk scarf. He stroked her hair, gazing at her face so peaceful it was almost strange. Inside, a vague fear stirred. Could this happiness last, or was it just a fragile blossom about to be torn from its roots? Claire awoke, eyes still closed, arms wrapped around Daniel as if afraid he might disappear. She murmured sleepily, "Don't leave me, no matter what happens." Daniel didn't reply, only held her tighter. He knew from this moment on, nothing would be the same. They had chosen a path with no way back, only forward into the darkness of the coming days, but at least, tonight, they truly belonged to each other. That morning, Claire left his room without saying goodbye, leaving only a small note on the desk. "Sometimes, I wish I'd never knocked on your door. But if I had the chance, I'd do it again. Because I wanted to know what it felt like to be truly alive, even for just one night." Daniel read that line over and over, his heart in turmoil but quietly warm. He knew he had entered a new chapter, one he could never predict, and no matter what lay ahead, he would never run away again. After that night, time no longer passed as steadily as before. For Daniel, each day was a string of anxious anticipation and fear. He and Claire continued to meet quietly in his tiny rented room. Lessons had turned into whispered conversations, sometimes just sitting together, a gentle touch of hands enough to set storms brewing beneath the skin. Yet that furtive happiness only highlighted the danger lurking nearby. That everything could vanish with a single suspicious glance from an adult, a casual question from the housekeeper, or an unexpected message from Claire's parents. Outside the Duvall mansion, the atmosphere seemed to shift as well. Every time Daniel came to teach, he felt the housekeeper's watchful gaze, overheard subtle, pointed questions from the butler about lesson times, even noticed Claire's father's car idling a little too long at the gate as if to check who had just left. Claire herself grew increasingly bold, no longer hiding her interest in Daniel. Some days, she would wear his shirt during lessons, leaving the collar open far more than necessary, shooting him mischievous looks in broad daylight right in front of the staff. She would rest her small hand atop his under the table, sometimes leaning in to whisper something in his ear that made him blush, helpless. One Saturday afternoon, as Daniel was explaining the various schools of literature, Claire suddenly picked up her pen and wrote along the edge of his textbook, "If I come to your room tonight, will you send me away?" He stared at that line, his heart racing. That night, Claire really did appear, knocking on his door after the city lights had come on. They fell into each other's arms like drowning souls finally finding air, passionate, reckless, oblivious to consequence. The more time they spent together, the more Daniel understood. This love was a fire that could not be put out. Whether it burned quietly or fiercely, it would always leave scars. But the deeper they went, the more they were surrounded by suspicion and pressure. One day, just as they returned to the mansion from his apartment, Daniel received an anonymous message. "Be careful with what you're doing. All secrets will be exposed." He was startled, deleting the message right in front of Claire, but he saw a flash of fear in her eyes he'd never seen before. A few days later, the housekeeper directly questioned Claire about a strange perfume in the classroom, about a man's dress shirt she'd left on the chair, about traces of lipstick on Daniel's teacup. Each question felt like a needle pricking at their pride and shame, making Daniel all the more tormented. He began to avoid her, spent less time in his apartment, offered Claire fewer affectionate glances when others were around. Yet the more he tried to restrain himself, the more the tension grew, like a cord tightening around both their throats, begging to snap. Claire couldn't bear it any longer. One rainy night, she dragged Daniel into a dark corner under the mansion's stairway, pressed her lips desperately to his. "I hate this feeling. I can't keep running forever. If you want to end it, just say so. But if not, I want us to live honestly, even just once, whatever happens." Daniel held her tightly, fear and longing mingling and making his lips tremble. He knew he wasn't strong enough to let her go, nor brave enough to make their love public. But what had to happen did. Late one night after a lesson, Daniel received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was stern Claire's father. "I want to see you tomorrow morning, in my office. This concerns my daughter and our family's reputation." Daniel went numb, sleepless the whole night, mind swirling with dread, afraid of exposure, of losing Claire, of having what little he had left ripped away. The next morning, in an elegant, wood-paneled office, Mr. Duvall looked at Daniel with icy eyes, not a word of pleasantry. "I hired you because I thought you knew your boundaries, but it seems I was wrong. Claire is still young, easily hurt, and this family will not tolerate anything that stains our name." He paused, pulling out a stack of secret photos. Claire outside Daniel's apartment, one of them sitting close together in the garden, her hand on his shoulder, another with the clear mark of a kiss on Daniel's neck. Daniel did not deny anything. He accepted every accusation in silence, standing like a target for the father's anger and contempt. "You can choose to end this. I'll pay your contract in full, pretend none of this ever happened. If not, the consequences will be harsher than you can imagine." Daniel left the office with a heavy heart. That evening, he arranged to meet Claire at the park behind the mansion. The rain drizzled, each cold drop sinking into their skin but unable to soothe the pain within. "I know everything," Claire said, tears mixing with rain, her lips trembling with anger and fear. "They want to tear us apart. I can't keep living like this, hiding, afraid, concealing every glance, every word." Daniel pulled her close, trying to sound strong, but his own voice was shaky. "I love you, Claire, but I can't let you suffer all the gossip, the stares. If I have to choose between our happiness and your peace, I'll choose to let you be free." Claire broke down, clutching him as if the world would fall apart if she let go. "Don't leave me. Don't let me be alone no matter what. I still want to be with you." Daniel pressed a final kiss to her lips, long, wet with tears. In that embrace, they both knew this wasn't just a farewell, but a quiet sacrifice for the one they loved, so she could live, grow, and be safe before their love could be crushed by judgment and the force of adults. After that, Daniel left the city. He sent no messages, made no contact, leaving all memories behind in an old leather bag and a few dog-eared poetry books. Claire returned to her role as the obedient daughter in the mansion, her smile dimmer but her eyes older. The only thing that remained between them were unfinished poems, books yet to be read, and a wound in their hearts that would never fully heal. Summer passed, and the city shifted into the pale gold days of early autumn. The Duvall mansion returned to its usual rhythm. Early mornings with the housekeeper sweeping leaves, Claire's parents leaving for work, quiet evenings without the sound of lessons echoing from the third-floor classroom. Every trace of Daniel seemed to have been erased from that house. The books were neatly arranged again, the teacups scrubbed clean of any lingering scent. Even the faint lipstick stains on the armrest had been replaced. Claire lived more quietly, but she was no longer the fragile girl she once was. She threw herself into studying for the university entrance exam, taking lessons with new tutors her parents hired, none of whom ever reached the depths of her gaze, eyes that once blazed with longing and love. Sometimes, on long, sleepless nights, Claire would open her drawer, take out the small notebook filled with poems and Daniel's old letters. She read them over and over, searching every line for a trace of those lost days, then quietly folded them away, hiding them as if someone might catch a glimpse of her entire past. The day of the entrance exam arrived in a gentle rain. Claire went alone. No one waited outside the school gates, and Daniel was no longer by her side. When the final test ended, she looked up at the gray sky, feeling a strange sense of calm. Not because she had forgotten, but because she now understood that every pain has its price. And that price was what made her grow, made her own up to every choice she'd made. Daniel had left the city, moving to a coastal town to teach literature at a small high school. He lived simply, teaching by day, returning to his rented room at night, reading and writing. He kept no contact with anyone from the old city, except sometimes, on rainy nights, when he would leaf through his old lesson plans or come across a note in Claire's handwriting. The longing would rise, then slowly settle, transforming into the quiet strength he needed to keep living. When the new academic year began, Daniel was invited to read poetry at a literary seminar at a major university in the city, the very place Claire had just entered as a language student. It was the first time he returned to that familiar world, walking those old hallways, feeling no regret now, only a peaceful acceptance. The auditorium was full. Daniel stood on the stage, reading poems about youth, about choices, about a kind of love no curriculum could ever teach. When he finished, the stage light swept across the audience, and there she was. Claire, sitting in the third row, her long hair softly draped, her face more mature, her eyes still tinged with sadness, yet now deeper and more radiant than ever. They met after the talk. For a long moment, neither said a word, they just looked at each other, letting memories rush in through the silence. Claire was the first to break the shyness. "I still keep all your letters, and the poem you read that night." Daniel smiled, his voice caught with emotion. "I'm still teaching, still rereading those old notebooks, still missing you even if I shouldn't." Claire smiled gently. "I'm not afraid anymore. I've grown up, passed my exams, learned to make my own choices and take responsibility for what I want. It's just, I still want to ask, do you believe in unplanned meetings?" Daniel looked into her eyes for the first time without fear or hiding. "I do. Like us meeting again today. Maybe life isn't just a string of lessons, but a collection of moments when we dare to live true to ourselves." They walked together under the autumn trees, shoulders brushing, quietly letting the past close behind them. No one spoke of starting over, no one made promises. But in their eyes, love remained, not loud but steadfast, like an underground stream, like a poem never finished to its last line. A few months later, in a small lakeside cafe, Daniel sat across from Claire, his fingers playing with a cup of coffee, his gaze gentle as she shared stories of her first days as a college student. They no longer had to hide, no longer had to guard every gesture or glance. The world outside was still full of judgment, still ready to condemn them at any moment, but they had both changed. They knew how to protect themselves, knew what really mattered. "How far do you think we've come?" Claire asked, her eyes shining under the golden light. Daniel gently took her hand, replying softly, "Farther than any syllabus ever taught. Far enough that just a look, a single line of poetry, is enough to know you've found the one your heart can never let go." So, after all the storms, separations, and longing, Their forbidden love did not die but transformed into a journey of growing up, a beautiful memory. Enough to keep living, enough to face every turn life might bring with courage. Because true love, even if it isn't in the syllabus, will always be the one lesson no one can learn for you.